Hello, and welcome back to the Garden of Grace devotion. My name is Pastor Katie, and I'm one of the pastors at Trinity Lutheran Church in Lilburn, Georgia. Today, I greet you with a confession, and my confession is that I have been sitting here trying to record this devotion for probably 45 minutes to an hour. I have recorded it and re-recorded it and re-recorded it, because I'm trying to find just the right words to talk about a particular type of temptation. And the type of temptation that I want to talk about today is the temptation to feel like perhaps there's just too much evil in the world for God to do anything about it. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever turned off the news? Have you ever looked at posts on social media? Have you ever overheard arguments? Have you ever been a part of arguments or saying things that you know you shouldn't, that caused harm or hurt or didn't glorify God? Have you ever found yourself wondering if perhaps there's just too much sin in you and others for God to really make a difference in the world? My grandmother had a saying years ago, and it was, things are just going to hell in a handbasket. I have no idea where that phrase came from, but it was a phrase that she used from time to time, not often. But it seems like things may just be going to hell in a handbasket. And when she said things like that, she was usually focused on something that had happened that wasn't great, and she'd be focusing on, like we all do sometimes, I think, on what is wrong or what isn't good, and how small maybe she felt in the midst of that. In the midst of her own struggles and challenges, in the midst of that which goes on in the world. And that's a temptation. It's a temptation that I feel sometimes. It's a temptation that I hear others talk about. The temptation to feel like perhaps God may not win. In our reading that I want to share with you today from Romans chapter 12, we see that this temptation has been around a really, really, really long time. Probably since the serpent entered into the garden all those years ago. The temptation has been there to wonder if good in the end really will overcome evil. In our reading from Romans, we have these words that Paul wrote to the early church in Rome, to a little tiny baby church. The estimates are pretty rough, right? I guess the ushers didn't take attendance, didn't count the numbers every Sunday and submit them. But because the numbers are very, very rough numbers, and the estimates are between 100 people and 2,500 people in the early church in Rome. So imagine these people gathered in small house churches, and all of them together add up to be around between 100 people and 2,500 people. In the context of Rome, which had roughly 1 million people. So we had this little tiny baby church, these little tiny baby churches in little houses, around 60 years after Jesus died and rose. And Paul is writing to this very small group of people who were at the same time saints and sinners, just like we are today. He was writing to them about how to get along with each other in the church, about how to live life as children of God. And he was also writing to them about how to interact with others in the world around them. My goodness, it could have, there's my dogs. My goodness, it could have been easy for Paul to just say, you know what? It's too big. The Roman Empire is too big. Forget it. Forget it. Just look after yourself and keep going. But he didn't. He didn't. Paul wrote these words. My dog is also very interested in them, apparently. Paul wrote these words to these early Christians. He wrote, "Let love be genuine. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with a mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor." What would it look like if we tried to do that? Do not lack in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Serve the Lord, you small amount of Christians in this big, scary place. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Hang on one second. Cinco, no sir. At this point, I'd really prefer not to restart the devotion again because seriously, I'm probably on take 20. So we're going to keep going. But this is what life is like, right? We journey, and then we have this barking interruption. And then we continue on. In the midst of all that life was throwing at them, Paul wrote to the people of the early church, rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and extend hospitality to strangers. What does our daily life look like if we focus on these things instead of what we feel like is going wrong or might be bigger than we can do anything about? What if we focus on the one person that we can control, which is ourselves? And we seek to let love be genuine. And we seek to hate what is evil and to hold fast to what is good. What if we rejoice in hope? What if we rejoice in hope? Paul then shifts in the passage. In those first 4 verses or so, he's talking about how he wants the people of the church to interact with each other. Then he shifts. He shifts to his focus, to how he wants the people within these little churches, how he wants them to interact with people outside of the church walls, how he wants them to interact with people when they go to the marketplace on Monday or Tuesday or whenever it is. When somebody cuts them off in their horse buggy, when somebody isn't kind to them. And he writes, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Man. Is Paul sure about that? I think so. I think so. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. In all of these things, Paul is inviting us over and over again to turn our attention to ourselves. To ourselves and who God is calling each one of us to be as children of God. Now, of course, someone has shown up with a mower down the street. But again, this is what life looks like. Paul continues on. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. This does not mean to perpetuate cycles of abuse. Sometimes one of the ways to live peaceably with all is to set a boundary and not allow someone to talk to you a certain way or treat you a certain way anymore. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. Paul then shifts into talking about how vengeance belongs to God, and then he ends with, I think, the most poignant sentence in this passage. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is from Matthew, and this is from Romans 12, verses 9 to 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul wrote those words to early Christians so many years ago who may have looked at the world around them and thought, it's too much, it's too big, what can I do? Yet God calls us to use the gifts we've been given. When we make a mistake, when we sin, when we return someone evil for evil, when we feel like saying things we shouldn't, when we say things we shouldn't, God calls us again and again to refocus on who God calls us to be as children of God. We are all at the same time sinner and saint. What does it look like, though? What does it look like? Even if just every person who watches this devotion, what does it look like if we seek, through God's grace, to try to do these things? Instead of using time and energy talking about what's going on that isn't good, or the evil that we see, what might it look like if each person, if we each tried to do the best we could to not be overcome by evil, but to overcome evil with good through God's grace? That does not mean that we don't busy ourselves with things that we need to do related to voting, related to standing up for those who need to be stood up for. It doesn't mean that we don't still advocate for the needs of others and social justice and all kinds of things. What it does mean, though, is when we have that still small voice in our brain saying, forget about it. The light of the Lord that shines within you and within them can't make a difference. This passage invites us to know that our God is bigger, and that in the end, good will triumph over evil. And in the meantime, until that day, may we seek to live as Paul encourages us to, focusing on who we're called to be as children of God, loving in ways that are genuine, holding fast to what is good. May God help us to not be overcome by evil, but to overcome evil with good. And may God's peace be with you today and always. Amen.